From Florence, Italy, the city of inspiration for sculptors in ages past and for centuries to come, you're listening to The Sculptor's Funeral. Good day to you all, and welcome back to The Sculptor's Funeral. I'm your host, Jason Arkles, a sculptor and teacher living and working in Florence, where all the great sculptors are dead. And I don't feel so well myself. The Sculptor's Funeral has been on vacation over the summer. It's October now, and I haven't done an episode since mid-June, and I have missed it. I've had a fantastic summer, and I hope you all did as well. My batteries are fully recharged, and I am champing at the bit to delve into the second season of the podcast. Now, the first season of The Sculptor's Funeral focused largely on the great sculptors of the Western European figurative tradition, right? All the biggies: Donatello, Michelangelo, Bernini, Canova, Rodin, and so on. I tried as much as possible to develop a sort of a through line to the history of sculpture so that not only could we understand each master in his own right, but understand how styles and practices changed from master to master and from age to age. I wanted to impart the notion that sculpture isn't just a list of one lone genius after another, but a continuum of ideas and styles which each master develops in his or her own way, and a continuum which is ongoing, involving the figurative sculptors of today. So, for you first-year sculpture students just tuning into the podcast for the first time, or anyone new to the study of the history of sculpture, I recommend browsing through the first 36 or so episodes which comprise the first season of The Sculptor's Funeral, if you are in search of an overview of European sculpture traditions. So, for the second season, what are we going to do? Well, now that we have all the greatest and most important masters out of the way, we can settle in and put a spotlight on particular eras, particular movements, and really chew over a time and a place to better understand the sculpture of that time and place. Along the way, we will learn about many of the so-called second-tier sculptors, all masters in their own right, but maybe not as groundbreaking or as game-changing as some of the others we've already discussed. They're best understood, these sculptors, in the context of a larger era or movement. So, for example, last season, I talked about the Florentine Renaissance in just 3 or 4 episodes. I talked a little bit about Donatello, and I had a podcast on the young Michelangelo, and then went straight into the Mannerists. Of course, the Florentine Renaissance was more than just Donatello and Michelangelo, and nearly 40 years separate their careers in sculpture. So for the first several history podcasts, we're going to talk about people like Lorenzo Ghiberti. Andrea Pizano will actually come up today. We got Desiderio di Settignano, Verrocchio. We're going to discuss the evolution of the study of anatomy at this time. We're going to discuss the hugely important Or San Michele, which is a small church in Florence that doesn't get nearly the attention it deserves, but is probably the most important sculptural site in Renaissance Florence. And we'll get around to more thoroughly covering the lives and works of Donatello and Michelangelo as well. So from here till, probably about Christmas or so, it's going to be all about the Florentine Renaissance. So those of you out there who are like, ugh, Renaissance, boring. Well, I'll see you guys in January. In today's episode, we're going to go all the way back to the beginnings of the Renaissance. But we're going to go even further back, even earlier than we did in the first season. Art historians have a few different convenient dates and events which mark the official beginning of the flowering of art and culture and intellect on the Italian peninsula, which we today call the Renaissance. But what date you choose as the official start of the Renaissance largely depends on your focus of study. For painters, it's going to be the career of Giotto, and for architecture, it might be the career of Arnolfo de Cambio. Both of these men lived and worked in the early years of the 14th century, or the 1300s, also known as the Trecento. For sculpture, usually, art historians will mention an event occurring almost a century later, and that event is the Great Sculpture Competition for the commission of modeling and casting a large set of bronze doors for the Florentine baptistry, and that happened around 1401. Now, it seems strange that the defining moment of the sea change between Gothic and Renaissance sculpture happens almost a century after similar events in painting and architecture. But the truth is that sculpture really has another, less commonly referenced start date. In addition to the year 1401, the year 1260 is also generally known as marking the beginning of Renaissance sculpture. Now, the reason there are two acknowledged beginnings occurring 140 years apart is because sculpture had what might be called a false start. Maybe false start isn't the best phrase, though. And let me try to explain. There definitely was a change in direction in Gothic sculpture starting in the 1260s that continued and evolved by fits and starts into the 1340s. But this new direction came to an abrupt halt in 1349 with the arrival of the Black Death, the plague. And sculpture didn't merely take a pause and then pick up where it left off after the Black Death left. Sculpture effectively reverted back to Gothic styles, because the link from master to pupil, which is a crucial component then and now in the survival of an artistic tradition, that link had been broken by the plague. Those artistic advances made since 1260 were practiced only by a small handful of sculptors in a very localized area, and so Renaissance sculpture's early existence had always been a very tenuous one, even before the plague's destructive impact. And it wasn't until the early 1400s when those links to that change in direction for sculptors was reestablished. So that's what we're going to look at today, the period of sculpture leading up to 1401. That shadowy era that is post-Gothic, sort of, and also pre-Renaissance, sort of. Maybe proto-Renaissance is a good way to put it. And it all starts with a sculptor by the name of Nicola Pizano. Now, Nicola Pizano was not actually from Pisa, as his surname implies, but from Apulia, the region of Italy comprising the heel of the boot of Italy. We don't know exactly where he was born or even when, but we assume he trained as a sculptor in the local workshops down south, which were often employed by the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, who was in residence in Sicily at the time. Now, in 1245, we find record of Nicola in building contracts in Siena and Lucca up in Tuscany. He worked as a journeyman sculptor, completing small jobs here and there under various masters, which is customary practice after completing one's apprenticeship. And at some point, he moved to Pisa, and it was here that he became a master, and hence his moniker of Nicola Pizano. Now, in Pisa in 1255, he received the commission to sculpt the pulpit for the baptistry in Pisa. Now, a pulpit is a small raised platform built inside the baptistry to be used as a speaking platform for the priest when he's preaching a sermon or reading from the Gospels. And a baptistry, by the way, is sort of a chapel that's built outside of a cathedral where new Christians could be baptized before they entered the church, both literally and metaphysically. Anyway, it took Nicola Pizano 5 years to complete this pulpit, and it is considered his masterpiece, or at least one of them. And the date of completion of the Pisa baptistry pulpit, 1260, for many art historians is Renaissance sculpture ground zero, as the baptistry pulpit was the first sculpture to contain elements of what we now recognize as Renaissance sculpture. What sort of elements, you ask? Well, the pulpit was the first late Gothic sculpture to consciously employ motifs, themes, and styles directly from classical antiquity. That is, of course, one of the things that makes a Renaissance a Renaissance. It's a rebirth of classical antiquity in terms of culture, intellect, government, philosophy, theology, literature, and the arts. I mean, Renaissance sculpture is more than simply classicism, but we'll come to the other components of Renaissance sculpture in a little bit. So anyway, how did all this nascent classicism that is evident in this pulpit, how did it all come about? Was Nicola Pizano approached by an enlightened bishop or a learned patron and then tasked with emulation of the ancients? No, it doesn't appear that this was the case. Rather, the idea of the use of classical motifs seems to come directly from Nicola himself. It was a personal fascination and admiration for works of antiquity, which Nicola encountered during his time close to the court of the Holy Roman Emperor. Anyway, in his journeyman days, Nicola was exposed to the ruins of ancient Rome, great sculptural works like Trajan's Column, the Arch of Constantine, and other statuary and monuments that he discovered along the way. And finally, in Pisa itself, Nicola admired the numerous Roman sarcophagi that were found there, dating from the rule of the Emperor Augustus in the 1st century AD. So, For evidence of Nicola's study of these ancient works, we only need look at the pulpit in the baptistry in Pisa. Now, I've got images of the pulpit up at the website, thesculptorsfuneral.com. Just click on the image gallery for this episode, which is episode number 37. Now, first of all, we can look at the decorative scheme of the pulpit itself. Now, the pulpit is a hexagonal platform set on 6 sort of slender columns, 3 of which are supported on the backs of stone lions. The platform of the pulpit has sort of chest-high stone railings around 5 of the 6 sides, and each section of railing is decorated with a relief sculpture depicting the life of Christ. Under these panels are the usual Gothic trefoil arches with decorated spandrels above the arches. Now, as for these 5 relief panels, as we pass from one to the other, they seem to represent an evolution from the traditional Gothic style into something new. Each panel more and more infused with ideas and forms borrowed from classical antiquity. Now we'll start sort of at the Gothic end of the spectrum with the panel depicting the Last Judgment. Now this is a completely typical example of Gothic relief work. The Last Judgment is a typical theme for relief work on the facades of French Romanesque churches in the 11th and the 12th centuries, and Nicola Pizano's 13th century relief would be right at home alongside those. We see the enthroned figure of Christ in judgment at almost twice the scale of everyone else in the relief, and that sort of emphasizes his centrality and importance. We see all the saved souls standing just sort of scattered around. No real sense of formal composition to this panel. It's all just sort of willy-nilly, all similar figures and similar gestures. And then we see the damned souls being led off by little demons to hell. Now, to our modern eyes, the modeling and the style, the random composition can seem a bit unsophisticated, and that kind of leads us to view the work as rather charming, rather than leaving us moderns with a sense of piety or dread. Pizano's subjects are rendered with a subtlety and a facility rare among his contemporaries, and even in works like this, even in traditionally Gothic works, he always was a very competent and creative and tasteful sculptor. But now let's look at another panel. Let's look at the panel of the Gift of the Magi, or the Nativity Panel, either one. And the first thing we might notice as different from the Last Judgment, or the Crucifixion Panel, for instance, is that there are fewer figures, they're larger in scale, and there is much more clarity in the compositions. Now, those who study such things could also point out that the robes worn by the character in these panels, their togas, they are meticulously rendered in the Roman style. And in the Nativity Panel, the Virgin Mary reclines in the center of the panel, rendered larger than the others to emphasize her importance, just as, as in the Crucifixion, and that's the Gothic way. But she resembles her pose, this sort of reclining on a sofa pose, explicitly resembles the type of figure found on Roman funerary monuments, the sort of noble woman in repose. And this figure seems to have more to do with antique models than with any Gothic precedent. But the real kicker on the pulpit comes in the form of the Renaissance's first ideal nude figure. This little sculpture, at the top of one of the pulpit's supporting columns, is a type of figure known as a virtue. Now, we know that a virtue is a moral quality. Those that are good, everyone who is good, they're good because they exhibit one or more virtues, right? Now, when we learn our theology, we learn that there are both Christian virtues, such as faith, hope, and charity, but that there are also a set of classical virtues, enumerated by Plato as justice, temperance, wisdom, and courage, right? So 3 Christian virtues and 4 classical ones. And what Nicola Pizano has put on his pulpit are several representations of these virtues. And the nude figure that Pizano created represents courage, which is a classical, not a Christian virtue, although the allegorical figure is given a biblical identification. This little statue represents courage as personified by the character of Daniel. On the pulpit, he stands nude with a lion's skin draped over his shoulder, leaving many to interpret the statue as representing Hercules. That may well have been the original intention, in fact, of this work, to actually sculpt him as a Hercules, but perhaps Hercules was just too overtly pagan to stand on a Christian pulpit. In any event, whether it's Hercules or it's Daniel, he is definitely rendered in the manner of a Roman or Greek ideal nude, standing in contrapposto with the schematic musculature of the ideal male torso, which is so familiar to us nowadays. This male torso is just sort of standing in full view. Now the message is clear. The courage of Daniel is a divine, ideal sort of courage, and this is reflected in his divine, ideal, perfect form. And that shows us that right from the beginning of the Renaissance, a sculptor was not just copying the outward aspects of antique sculpture. He wasn't just saying, "Oh, I'll just make it look like an Apollo." He was using the ideal form in the way that the classics did as well, to represent an embodiment of an ideal virtue. Now, I'm not going to dwell on the baptistry pulpit and all the little clues it contains, which give evidence that Nicola Pizano had a thing for the antique. It's enough for us to know that in this work, as well as in another pulpit he made for the cathedral in Siena, the influence of the antique was clearly visible and was remarkable for the time. Everyone could see it, and it brought Nicola a good deal of notoriety. Now, it might come as a bit of a surprise that classical sculpture, with its links to pagan religion, would have been allowed to be so directly referenced in a work of art for a Christian church in the Middle Ages. I haven't read anything touching this issue in particular, this early acceptance of pagan influence on Christian art, but obviously it did happen. Scholars agree that a major source of inspiration for Nicola Pizano's pulpit was the Arch of Constantine in Rome. The decorative figures in the spandrels above the Gothic arch, and the niche figures on top of the column capitals, and the relief panels above that, that's all a composition derived from the Arch of Constantine. And that fact might be the clue to this acceptance of antique art in the Christian realm, because Emperor Constantine, if you recall, was the first Christian Roman emperor. The arch itself, the Arch of Constantine, commemorates a military victory Constantine achieved in the year 315 AD, after Constantine received a vision of God, where God assured Constantine of victory if he and his soldiers put Christian symbols on their shields. This episode was the beginning of Constantine's conversion to Christianity, and inscriptions on the Arch of Constantine itself celebrate the divine intervention as well as the victory. So I would think that if there is one work from classical antiquity from which a medieval sculptor might get away with referencing, it would be the Arch of Constantine, as it is as much a reference to classical Christianity as anything else. So now we have the beginnings of the manifestation of the Renaissance in sculpture. But the success and popularity of drawing from antique sources was very limited at this time. In fact, Nicola Pizano's own son, Giovanni Pizano, who worked side by side with Nicola, with his father, for many years, notably on the Siena pulpit, reverted to a much more Gothic style of sculptural handling than his father had practiced. The true heir to Nicola Pizano's classicizing advancements came from another sculptor working under Nicola and alongside Nicola's son Giovanni, a man by the name of Arnolfo de Cambio. Today, we mostly remember Arnolfo de Cambio for his achievements in architecture. Arnolfo was the architect of early Renaissance Florence. He designed and oversaw the construction of many landmarks in Florence still standing today. The Palazzo Signoria, for instance, which is the town hall of Florence, the Church of Santa Croce, and of course, he was the original architect for Florence's famous cathedral, or Duomo. But he started his career as a stone carver, working as Nicola Pizano's top assistant on the second of his pulpits, the one in Siena. And from there, and for the next few decades, Arnolfo de Cambio worked all around the Italian peninsula on funerary monuments and other statuary, finally arriving, more or less to stay, in Florence in the 1290s, when his main preoccupation became architecture. But in addition to architecture, he also made several statues for the facade of the Duomo itself, which still survive. And in these works, we can detect a very strong classical strain, which de Cambio learned not only from his master Nicola, but from his own extensive travels, just as his master had done. In some work, he seems to copy entire portrait heads from Trajan's column in Rome onto the statues of his saints. One statue in particular, a statue of Santa Reparata, who was a patron saint of Florence, is so faithful, the style of this statue is so faithful to late Roman workmanship that in later centuries, everyone thought it actually was Roman. It was originally made for the Duomo facade, but it found its way into the hands of the Medici in later centuries after it and the other statues were removed from the Duomo to make way for a second facade. And anyway, this Santa Reparata was eventually placed as a decorative garden statue in the Boboli Gardens here in Florence, with a bunch of other actual Roman sculptures. It wasn't until the early 20th century that Arnolfo de Cambio's Santa Reparata was rediscovered and conserved inside the Duomo Museum, where it is today. So here we see that the impulse and the precedent to draw inspiration from the antique lasted into a second generation, which helped to provide guidance for even later generations of sculptors in this proto-Renaissance. But before I go any further, I need to point out that drawing inspiration from the antique, making sculpture in the style of antique work, of Roman work and Greek work, this is only a part of what makes Renaissance sculpture different from Gothic sculpture. Now, if copying the antique were all there was to it, the Renaissance would have been a pretty uninspiring period in art, and of course, it was anything but boring. So in addition to the synthesis of Gothic sculpture with antique styles, there were other inspirations and advancements which give Renaissance sculpture a new, unprecedented look and feel to them. These inspirations can be summed up in two words: artistic cross-pollination. Is that 2 words or 3? Anyway, we'll discuss what I mean by artistic cross-pollination in the Proto-Renaissance when the sculptor's funeral continues. Hey, podcast listeners! The Sculptor's Funeral is made possible by your generous donations, as well as by our sponsor, Blick Art Supplies. That's right, friends, Blick Art Supplies, the largest and oldest provider of art supplies in the United States, shipping their quality wares around the world. Their superior customer service, extensive selection, and competitive prices make them the choice for professional and amateur artists, art educators, architects, designers, students, and hobbyists. Virtually anyone requiring quality art materials for work or for pleasure. And seriously, there isn't another art supplier on the web with as many supplies and materials specifically for sculptors than Blick. It's really huge. They have over 70,000 products for artists of all types. You can get everything you need, from dozens of different clays and plasters to fine Italian marble carving tools, clay modeling tools, specialty casting mediums, body casting supplies, turntables, armatures, books on sculpture, you name it. If you need it for sculpture, they got it. And shipping is free in the U.S. for most items if your order is over $100. But Blick is not merely a place to buy stuff. Their sales staff and product information specialists are trained to hunt down answers to your tough questions regarding materials, techniques, and safety. Hundreds of Blick videos are also available at dickblick.com and on YouTube, including video lesson plans for teachers and product demonstrations for artists. And best of all, by buying your art supplies from Blick, you contribute directly to the support of the Sculptor's Funeral podcast. All you need to do is this. Go to the podcast website, thesculptorsfuneral.com, and click on any of the banner links that you see there. And that will take you right to the Blick website where you can buy whatever you need. It's that simple. Just remember that you need to click through a link on thesculptorsfuneral.com first so that Blick knows I sent you. So the next time you stock up on armature wire, mold rubber, modeling tools, and plastilina, do it in a way that supports the only podcast out there devoted to the global community of figurative sculpture. Go to thesculptorsfuneral.com and click on Blick and support the show. Thanks. Okay, so before the break, I mentioned that there was more to Renaissance art than simply copying antique styles. When we look at sculpture from the early 15th century, it's not simply people copying a style like the various Mannerist periods of art history. No, the sculpture of the early Renaissance is different from Gothic, but it's not classical either. It's something with elements of both, but there's a large element of something else, something entirely new. Now, what was this element? Where did it come from? Well, what needed to happen, and what indeed did happen, was that there was a change in actual working techniques during the Proto-Renaissance. Sculptors made sculpture in a different way. using a different process than had been done before. So it was the technical and procedural changes, as well as the influence of the antique, that led to a truly new sculpture. The earliest of these advances came about as the result of a collaboration between a sculptor and a painter, and that painter was none other than Giotto di Bandone. Now, Giotto was a painter born around the time Nicola Pizano was finishing his Siena pulpit. That places him about a generation after Arnolfo de Cambio. Now, there are many myths intertwined with the biography of Giotto. How, as a youth, he was nothing more than just a shepherd boy, but was discovered by the great Byzantine painter Cimabue, who happened upon the young Giotto in a field where Giotto was drawing pictures of his sheep from life on a rock. Cimabue was so impressed with the young shepherd's talent that he took him on as his apprentice. Now, this probably is just a creation myth rather than actually history. We can't even say for sure that Cimabue taught Giotto at all, but like most myths, it does help to explain Giotto's nature and meaning. We recognize and celebrate Giotto today as being the first painter at the dawn of the Renaissance to break from the traditions of the Tuscan workshops and study not just the skills and habits of his master, but to examine the natural world around him as a source of inspiration and creativity. That Giotto drew from life is the point of the myth, which has him drawing sheep in a field. His examination of the world as he saw it led to groundbreaking and fundamental changes in painting. Along with pretty decent attempts at optical perspective in the architecture within his paintings, we find in Giotto's work a strong sense of pictorial composition. Instead of the Byzantine or Gothic tradition of grouping similar subjects, like a bunch of angels or a bunch of saints, all together in a repeating symmetrical pattern, Giotto saw in the world around him people in groups with a variety of poses and expressions and physical types, and he drew what he saw. He understood that a painting can be more than just a collection of recognizable symbols and characters on a gold background. It could be like a window into another world, and through that window we see space, pictorial space, with a foreground and a background, and the things in the distance are smaller and the things up close are larger. He saw that adding seemingly unimportant details like trees or birds or an untied sandal, these little details help to create a more convincing scene. In short, before Giotto, Byzantine and Gothic painting conveyed information, but after Giotto, painting told a story. Giotto's work was revolutionary and was celebrated by his contemporaries, and he enjoyed a long and successful career. He painted fresco cycles which we can still see today in places like Padua, Assisi, and Florence. He spent a good deal of the last 30 years of his life in Florence, though he was often called away on assignment elsewhere. And in addition to frescoes and panels and crucifixes in churches, in 1334, Giotto was appointed to the position of architect for the Duomo. Now, cathedrals like the Florence Duomo can take over a century to build, so the position of architect was usually held by a succession of the best artists of the day. After the death in 1310 of Arnolfo de Cambio, who was a sculptor, architect, and heir to the classically infused style of Nicola Pizano, the position of architect went to a guy named Tino di Camaino, a much more typically Gothic stone carver, and as an architect he wasn't so hot, and work slowed on the Duomo under Tino's direction. But in 1331, a prosperous guild took up the task of getting the Duomo back on track. Now, this guild was the Arte della Lana, which is the guild that oversaw the trades which turned raw bales of wool into cloth. Now, medieval and early Renaissance Florence's wealth was based upon the wool trade, and the guilds connected to wool and other textiles were powerful and wealthy. There were a few dozen guilds in Florence, some major, some minor, but the three most powerful guilds were the Arte della Lana, or Wool Guild, the Arte di Calimala, or Cloth Importers and Cloth Dyers Guild, and the Banking Guild, or Arte del Cambio. These three guilds were intertwined in the Florentine government at the highest levels, and as such, each took responsibility over various civic building projects. One such project, the construction of the Duomo, became the province of the Arti della Lana. Now, when the Arti della Lana took over the supervision of the Duomo, one of the changes they made was hiring Giotto himself as the new architect of the Duomo. He held this position for just a few years, from 1334 to 1337, but it was long enough for Giotto to design the campanile, or bell tower, which is associated with the cathedral. And today, that bell tower is still known as Giotto's Campanile, even though it was only begun during his lifetime, and later architects altered the designs somewhat. Another civic project, that of refurbishing the baptistry of the Duomo, was in the hands of the Arte di Calamala, the Cloth Importers and Cloth Dyers Guild. One important part of that project was to create a set of monumental bronze doors for the baptistry. Pisa, Florence's rival just down the river, had recently erected a beautiful set of large bronze doors for their new cathedral, and not wanting to be outdone, the Arte di Calamala, on the advice of Giotto, hired a goldsmith named Andrea Pizano to make the Florence baptistry doors. Now, Andrea Pizano, he's no relation to Nicola or Giovanni Pizano. He likely just matriculated as a master goldsmith in Pisa, and possibly worked on Pisa's bronze doors while he was there. So Andrea Pizano, he was a goldsmith, but casting large works in bronze, something as big as bronze doors, at this time was not something your average goldsmith was really capable of. The job of actually casting bronze doors like this would usually fall to bell founders or cannon founders, those who cast large church bells or cannons. Now, goldsmiths, like Andrea Pizano, were a distinct set of tradesmen from bell founders and cannon founders in a couple ways. And one, obviously, is just the scale of the casting. Goldsmiths made jewelry and ornaments and tableware and such. Bell founders also had a simpler casting process, which was less suited for the fine details a goldsmith required for their castings. But goldsmiths were distinct from bell founders also in the level of skill they possessed in modeling in wax and clay. Cannons and bells are fairly basic in form and utilitarian in function, while goldsmiths were tasked with creating detailed objects, often figures or animals, out of precious metals, and therefore were likely to be highly skilled modelers and chasers. So Andrea Pizano modeled the wax originals for the bronze doors, and bell founders from Venice were hired to cast them. Andrea Pizano started the work in 1330, and the doors were finished in 1336. Let's take a closer look at these doors. It's a set of 2 doors, and each door holds 14 bronze panels, so there's 28 panels in total. The top 20 panels are a chronological illustration of the life of John the Baptist, which of course makes perfect sense for the doors of a baptistry. And the bottom 8 panels each represent a virtue. You remember there are 3 Christian virtues and 4 classical virtues. Representing the virtues was a pretty popular motif those days, and you remember that there were 3 Christian virtues and 4 classical virtues. But the 8th panel took the unprecedented step of adding to the canon of virtues the virtue of humility, a virtue popularized by St. Francis of Assisi, who had preached in Florence the century before. As for the style of the modeling for these panels, we see in sculpture, for the first time, the sense of pictorial space that was pioneered by the painter Giotto. Stylistically, Andrea Pizano owes more to Giotto than to any sculptor. There's even a theory that Giotto himself designed the compositions of the panels, which Andrea merely then just produced in wax. Giotto, after all, recommended Andrea Pizano for the job, but there isn't any documentation of this collaboration, despite heavy documentation for the rest of the project generally, so I kind of find it doubtful. In fact, Giotto wasn't even in Florence at the time. He was in Naples in the years that Andrea was modeling the doors. But what can't be denied is that Andrea Pizano is a true disciple of Giotto. Unlike the cluttered compositions and self-conscious classicizing of Nicola Pizano's pulpits, in Andrea Pizano's work we find simple, clarified spaces and groupings of figures that do not overwhelm the picture plane. We even find the same sort of mountainous and craggy landscapes in Andrea's work that typifies so much of Giotto's landscapes. And the fact that there are landscapes in these reliefs at all is a big tip-off that Andrea is pursuing new ideas of pictorial space in relief sculpture. If you go to the image gallery at thesculptorsfuneral.com, you will find some side-by-side comparisons of Giotto's work and Andrea Pizano's work. I mentioned earlier the idea of cross-pollination of the arts as being part of the revolution of Renaissance sculpture. Now, following Giotto's example of creating a more pictorial space in relief work, as well as turning to nature and to visual stimulus generally as a source of form in sculpture, is part of what I mean by that cross-pollination. Sculptors were learning from painters at this time. This type of cross-pollination prefigures the Mannerist period, which was to happen 200 years later in Florence, when Michelangelo, a sculptor, would influence generations of painters. The history of Western art can provide several examples when a breakthrough in one field of art influenced other fields. Andrea Pizano's doors were finished during the time that Giotto was the architect of the Duomo in 1336. And although Giotto was to die only a short time later, in 1339, Andrea Pizano and Giotto finally did work in direct collaboration on the campanile, the bell tower of the Duomo. While Giotto finished the architectural design and oversaw construction of this bell tower, Andrea was in charge of the decorative relief scheme on the walls of the tower. And this relief decoration came in the form of relief panels, several rows of them, either diamond-shaped or hexagonal-shaped little panels set in several rows going all the way around the tower. Now, these rows of panels represented several things. They represented the 7 virtues, that ever-popular theme, but also the 7 sacraments and the 7 works of mercy, the 7 planets, the mechanical arts, the creative arts, the book of Genesis, and much more. Now, stylistically, all these relief panels are hand in hand with Andrea's work on the baptistry doors. And it is quite likely that as architect of the Duomo, Giotto had a very strong hand in the design of these panels. Again, there's no direct confirmation of this in the existing records, but it is highly likely that Giotto had a hand in the compositions. There is even some anecdotal reference to Giotto's hand in the panel design from a very, very interesting source about a century later, and that comes from the sculptor Lorenzo Ghiberti. Lorenzo Ghiberti was a contemporary of Donatello, so working in the early 15th century, and in his memoirs, Ghiberti claims that he had seen with his own eyes models for the stone panels of the campanile, and Ghiberti attributed the creation of these models to Giotto rather than to Andrea Pizano. But then again, who knows? These models that Ghiberti saw don't survive, and Ghiberti, writing a century after the fact, could well have been wrong. But the panels for the campanile are more significant for the advancement of Renaissance sculpture than simply marking the collaboration between a sculptor and a painter. They mark another type of artistic cross-pollination, one that was to fundamentally change the way marble and stone sculpture was made by everyone, and I mean absolutely everyone, until the advent of modernism in the late 19th century. We'll discuss this fundamental change in the process of sculpture when the Sculptor's Funeral continues. Hi everyone, Jason here. I just want to take a minute to thank some of the people who were responsible for my having an excellent summer teaching workshops in the UK. Not only do I want to give a big thanks to Nina of Mapstone Studios in Devon, and Charlie and Mark at Draycott Foliot in Wiltshire, but to all the course participants who joined in as well. I'm really looking forward to next summer, where I'll be giving more workshops on stone carving, écorché anatomy, and figure modeling in Wiltshire, Devon, and hopefully elsewhere in the UK. So if you wanted to join in last time and you weren't able to, no worries. In the coming months, I'll be letting everyone know the schedule for next summer so that there's plenty of time to plan ahead. But I also want to let everyone know that now that I'm back in my lovely adopted home of Florence, my teaching studio here is now in full swing. My atelier is a little different from most teaching studios. I've recently moved away from offering course plans based on the academic year, and I now offer private and semi-private lessons, catering especially to those who want to study in Florence but can't come for an extended period. In the last year, I've had students of all experience levels work with me one-on-one or in groups of up to 4 from all 6 continents, and for periods ranging from 1 week to 6 months. And I always work alongside my students, providing an ongoing demo of every step of the way. The nice thing about one-to-one intensive training like this is that the student has the opportunity to focus on their personal needs and interests, whether it's portraiture, figure modeling, technical aspects of sculpture, anatomy, drapery, or even marble carving. And, of course, each student gets an earful of art history from me on a regular basis. So if you're interested in coming to Florence and working alongside me in my studio, I encourage you to check out my personal website, jasonarkles.com, where you can find all about my teaching studio and contact details. That's jasonarkles.com, and I'll see you in Florence. Okay, to understand this latest fundamental change in sculptural production, which I mentioned before the break, we need to look at what sculptural production was in the 1300s. Now, in a nutshell, the conception of what a sculptor did was very different then from how we view the profession today. The processes and products of sculpture were produced by 2 distinct categories of craftsmen. There were goldsmiths, who worked in metals and produced castings from wax or clay models, and then stone carvers, who produced stone and marble sculpture. Now, the reason for this division is fairly obvious, right? These are 2 different skill sets. A goldsmith or a carver might arrive at the same sort of work. For instance, they both can produce a figure or a relief, but they use completely different methods to get to either a marble relief or a bronze relief. I talk a little bit about these differences in the Donatello podcast from the last season. One thing I mentioned then was that Gothic carvers, when carving something simple like a relief or a very simple figure, did not usually employ wax or clay models as rough drafts, but were generally direct carvers, as far as we can tell. When something more complex required a preparatory model, this was made on a small scale, and it was used to largely determine proportion and composition, and not as they are commonly used by carvers today. Carvers today, and for the last several centuries, will work their ideas out right down to the finest detail in their clay, and usually at the scale of the intended finished work. And then once the clay model is perfect, it'll be cast in plaster and then copied into marble with a great deal of exactitude. Now, in the traditions of the Gothic workshops, this was considered a needless step in the process. The fact is that carving details is kind of the easy part of marble carving. I can take a complete beginner and in a week teach that person to carve a finger or an eye or any detail that you want. But what's difficult is making sure that that finger is sitting correctly on the hand, and that the hand is connected well to the wrist, and that the arm is in the correct position and pose so that it naturally hangs from the torso, and so on, right? It's the big shape. It's the relation of each part to the whole, the composition and proportion, even in the context of a very simple figure, is difficult to just eyeball and get right and carve directly. And that is why and how Gothic carvers used models, when they did use them at all. So when models were used by carvers, they would be on a small scale, as I mentioned, and not very detailed because there was no need. And apparently, these models were of a quality low enough where they were discarded after the marble was carved. At least that has to be our assumption, because we can find no clay or wax models that were made as models for carving which survive before Andrea Pizano. And of course, those don't survive at all. We only know about them through the writings of Ghiberti. So goldsmiths and metalsmiths, as opposed to carvers, those guys were the craftsmen who gained real expertise in modeling, because casting in metal requires an initial form from which a mold is taken. And the more accurate a goldsmith's modeling was, the less reworking and chasing was required on the casting after it was poured. And that meant a savings in time and money. So modeling in plastic materials was squarely within the province of the metalsmiths, and only tangentially related to carvers. So with that in mind, let's turn back to Andrea Pizano, the goldsmith. Remember, after the commission of the bronze doors, Andrea Pizano collaborated with Giotto, the architect of the Duomo, to produce a series of reliefs for the bell tower, but notably these reliefs are not in bronze, they're in stone. So why was a goldsmith given the task to produce stone reliefs for the campanile. Well, Andrea Pizano, first of all, was Giotto's #1 fan, at least among sculptors. Andrea got it. He got what Giotto was trying to do in paint and was either following along the same lines or at least was willing and capable of putting Giotto's designs into three-dimensional form. Where Andrea Pizano picked up carving, who knows? It could have been in his early days on the construction site of the cathedral in Pisa, or later at the construction site of Florence's Duomo. But what is relevant, and what is very important, is that when Andrea Pizano migrated from metalsmith to stonework, he brought his modeling skills with him. Now, a century after the fact, Lorenzo Ghiberti mentions having seen models for these relief panels and attributing them to Giotto. But whether or not they're by Giotto or Andrea Pizano, they must have been fairly decently rendered and detailed models, because they were deemed interesting or valuable enough to have been preserved, at least down into the 15th century. So we might imagine that they had a fair bit of detail and workmanship, the kind of effort we might expect from a goldsmith. Andrea Pizano was not the first goldsmith to turn his hand to stone carving, but he is the earliest recorded instance of a carver using detailed, and we can presume full-scale models to produce the final work in stone. It's evidence of exacting and precise copying the model into stone. And accordingly, there is a greater complexity of design in these stone relief panels than in any contemporary work, even work by Nicola Pizano or Arnolfo de Cambio. The figures in Andrea Pizano's works, they overlap each other in a way that not even painters were attempting at the time. Objects and figures are seen even overlapping the relief frames themselves, sort of coming out of the picture, as it were. Now, when you carve a relief directly, right, direct carving relief without a model, you start with a blank stone, and the composition can be drawn onto the surface of the stone in pencil or charcoal or whatever. And then these outlines or reliefs of the figures are incised, and the background is cut down, and the figures, sort of pop out. But when modeling a relief in clay or wax, you don't start with a big block of clay or wax and then carve the figures in like you do with stone. No, you start with the background, right? And then figures and objects are added to this background, and in succession, you can build up a single figure and then another figure on top of that, and then maybe a third figure who sort of is reaching across the other two. And in this way, you can construct a very complex composition out of the accumulation of simpler forms. As I said, not even painters of the time were attempting the complexity of some of these relief compositions. If you go to thesculptorsfuneral.com and check out the image gallery, check out Andrea Pizano's reliefs, which detail the arts of medicine and the one that details the art of weaving. Now, notice the complexity of the overlapping figures in the panel that represents the arts of medicine. You've got these three figures, one sort of center figure sort of lying at a greater depth behind the other two. Notice the deep undercuts of the jars on the shelf above them. And in the weaving panel, note the excellent attempt at perspective in the rendering of the weaving loom. It's made to appear as though it projects out towards the viewer. Now, this sort of thing would have been exceedingly difficult to carve directly, even with a detailed pencil drawing on top of the stone. Also note how the figure in the weaving panel overlaps the frame. Now, that's a telltale sign of the use of a wax or clay model made by some additive process. You started with the frame and then added the figure on top. Another equally telling sign is that the relief, which shows the art of medicine, wasn't even carved by Andrea Pizano himself, but by his son. But the quality of craftsmanship is remarkably consistent to the ones carved by Andrea. Belying the use of models for each of these panels, the models would have been made by the same hand. So here we seem to have the genesis of a sculptural process that became fundamental for European marble sculpture for the next 6 centuries, the use of detailed clay or wax models for copying into a carved material. This process is the last of what I call the 3 Gothic game changers. First, we have the acceptance and influence of classic sculpture into the Gothic idiom. That's one game changer. We all know how important that became in the next several centuries. The Renaissance, the Baroque, the Rococo, and then, of course, finally Neoclassicism, all can be considered responses to classical influence. Then we have the influence of pictorial space into the sculptor's vocabulary, which was introduced by Giotto. And in the following decades, we see the influence of visual information in sculpture via optical perspective, notably with Ghiberti's so-called Gates of Paradise, and the increasing reliance on visual information coming from living models. And finally, we have this cross-pollination between the processes of stone carvers and goldsmiths, which give birth to a new breed of craftsman. Not a goldsmith, not a stone carver, but a sculptor. A sculptor who models in clay and wax and carves in stone. All the elements are now present for a revolution in sculpture. But that revolution was not to happen for another half-century. You see, after Giotto's death in 1339, Andrea Pizano was appointed to be the new architect of the Duomo, where he greatly contributed to the building of the Campanile, and he was in his prime when, in 1348, a calamity hit Florence that would forever change the history of that city, the Black Death, the plague. It arrived, and within 2 years, somewhere between 30 and 60% of Florence's population, it's impossible to know for sure, between 30 and 60% of the population died. And among the dead, we number Andrea Pizano, who succumbed in 1349. Now, it's important to stress that the achievements of Nicola Pizano, Arnolfo de Cambio, and then finally Andrea Pizano were not representative of a larger trend at the time. These guys were literally the only ones breaking away from the Gothic tradition the way they did. It was a very localized advancement, and the survival of these advancements depended on just one or two people passing on their skills and techniques to just one or two apprentices. And when the Black Death took Andrea Pizano, this precious lineage was almost wiped out. Only one apprentice under Andrea Pizano can be considered a true heir to this proto-Renaissance sculpture, and his name was Andrea Orcagna. But most of Andrea Orcagna's career after the plague was taken up with the construction of a magnificent tabernacle found in Orsa Michele, and this work is a piece of decorative architecture said to be the greatest example of late Italian Gothic style. And he died in 1368, and he left behind no young masters to carry the torch of classicism or the new sculptural processes for the next generation. The sculptural output of Florence was once again plunged back into Italian Gothic style. Now, the last two slides on the image gallery are a vivid illustration of the static, unchanging nature of Gothic technique. The images are of two statues. Both are seated virgins holding the infant Jesus in her lap. One was carved by Arnolfo de Cambio in the first years of the 1300s, and the other was carved almost a century later in 1399 by a sculptor named Niccolo Lamberti, who had come from Milan to work in Florence, bringing his northern Italian Gothic style with him. And though a century separates these two statues, stylistically, they might be sisters. There is no hint of the remarkable and ill-fated advancements made by Giotto or Andrea Pizano, which lived and died between the creation of these two works. But the plague doesn't carry off sculpture like it does sculptors. Sculpture has a habit of sticking around. Though the masters themselves were long dead by the year 1400, the sculpture of the past masters of the preceding century and a half had an enormous influence on a new generation of young goldsmiths who, in the depopulated city of Florence, found their skills and talents very much in demand. And these young goldsmiths revived and continued the journey towards a new style. Ghiberti, Brunelleschi, Donatello, Nanni da Banco, Jacopo della Quercia. These were the new generation of sculptors, who we now regard as the old masters of sculpture. But Nicola Pizano, Arnolfo de Cambio, and Andrea Pizano were the old masters' masters. Well, I want to thank you all for listening. And if you started listening to the podcast over the summer, if you've recently discovered the Sculptor's Funeral, I want to thank you for joining us. And you should know that you can join in the conversation at our Facebook group page for the Sculptor's Funeral. You can ask a question there. You can leave a comment about the podcast or about sculpture in general. You can post current events and more. You can also subscribe to the podcast at Stitcher Mobile or on iTunes, or subscribe from any service from which you get your podcasts. And you can receive the podcast automatically on your PC, tablet, or mobile every week. Check out the website, thesculptorsfuneral.com, where you can stream the complete archives of the show without having to subscribe to anything, and for free. You can check out the image galleries for this and for every other episode at the Sculptor's Funeral. And you can click on the sponsor of the podcast, Blick Art Supplies. Doing so supports the podcast, and for that, I thank you. Thanks again for listening, and have a productive week.